All right, let us pray. Almighty God, today as we read the Transfiguration, we ask you to transform our hearts and minds as we contemplate and read the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and give us more mountaintop moments in our life. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so conveniently, and I should have done some of this earlier, but I didn't think of it. So conveniently, I'm going to start with some photos, and I think that you might like some of these. So share my screen, photos. Okay, can you see my screen? All right,
Yep.
So the Transfiguration takes place up most likely. I mean, they don't know exactly for sure. And when we read the passage, you'll see that there weren't all that many people there. But there's two mountains that are likely to have been the Transfiguration in the traditional places. Mount Tabor is the more likely of the two. And as we go through the passage, I will try to remember what the other mountain is, because I should know it, but I've just forgotten it off the top of my head. But Mount Tabor is up north, and can you see my arrow right here? So that's it. It's that kind of bubble-shaped mountain. The guidebooks call it a breast-shaped mountain, but there it is. It's very obvious when you're there. I'm actually at Megiddo right here, which is on the other side of the Jezreel Valley, and you can sort of see that it is very green and very lush and very farmy, right? There's all sorts of stuff here. And there's a very important road that goes to basically it goes from Damascus down to Egypt, that goes through Israel, that goes right by here on this. I think it was sort of right here. You can see the road right there. So this is a fairly, even back then, this was that road is a Roman road that's still active today. So it was a very heavily traveled place, and Jesus was doing a lot of his northern Galilee ministry up in this area. So this is what it looks like from the panoramic view, for what it's worth. This is still from Megiddo. There's the road. You can actually see the road right here going by us. And way off is Mount Tabor over there. There's me, and there's Mount Tabor again. Still there's the road. Then we're driving over to it, so I began to get closer to it. Or maybe I zoomed in, but we'll get closer to it in a second. There it is again. This is not part of our class, but one of the things we'll mention in the Transfiguration narrative is there's some comparisons to Elijah and Moses. And do you remember the scene where Elijah, we read this probably last year at some point, but where Elijah has the confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and they pile up all this stuff and then douse it in water. And he says, now make it turn into fire if your God can actually do that. And they dance around and cut themselves up. And there's a whole bunch of them dancing around an altar, and they can't make it turn into fire. And then and then Elijah prays to God, and it turns into fire. This giant thing is a stone altar from the Canaanite era. So this is probably the type of altar that Elijah would have done that sort of thing on, just to give you an idea. It's giant. Like, these stones are yay big, probably. So it's probably the size of our sanctuary area at church, as opposed to the size of our altar at church. So just to give you an idea of what, and you can see there were stairs going up into it. So they would go up into the altar, and they would pile things up here and sacrifice them with the view of everybody. And if you can sort of see, this is in Megiddo, it's actually down below, so you could stand around it, and everybody could see it from below, and everybody could see it from above. So it's sort of like a outdoor worship amphitheater type of space. Anyway, that has nothing to do with today, except it's a neat picture, and Elijah will come up. But so there again is Mount Tabor, which is, as I said, one of the traditional, probably the most traditional and most likely site of the Transfiguration. We were driving to it. There it is. This was just me on my alone pilgrimage part. This was not the full group. Getting closer to it. I wonder if I actually have any video. I probably do. But as we got, this is the town of Tabor, aptly named. And then I took video going up, which I should share with you at some point because it's terrifying. But we drove up like maniacs and got up there, and this is the Church of the Transfiguration that is built on the traditional spot where the Transfiguration happened. So just it's all the way up here at the top of this mountain, and there's been a church here for a long, long time. This is I think a Crusader era chapel, which was built before this current building. And there's another little chapel that was built before that. So Christians have been venerating this spot as the Transfiguration really for a long time, about 15 or 1600 years, at least, with churches that are excavated. There's the Crusader Chapel again. There I am. There's my guide, Rami. So this is inside. Unfortunately, it was roped off and we couldn't get down, but I tried to zoom in as I could on the photos. It's a neat little church. There's sort of a double altar setup going on. There's one up top, and then there's a lower one down here. Different chapels are dedicated, and as when we read this, you'll see why. They're dedicated to, guess who that is? Based on the story I just told. You're muted. Did you say Elijah?
Elijah?
Yes,
Yeah.
You're Elijah. So for what it's worth, they have the whoever did this art should have gone over to Megiddo and taken a look at the size of the altar, right? It's a tiny little altar. This is Elijah's altar that's on fire. This is the Canaanite one that it's not, right? Or the prophets of Baal. They probably would have been quite a bit bigger. This is a chapel to St. Francis, I believe, because they are Franciscans.
Mm.
You can see the lower chapel. The art in this church, it's newish, but it's very pretty. The image up here is the Transfiguration. There's Jesus. Any idea who that person is? Holding what looks
Moses?
like the 10 Commandments. Yep. And that's Elijah carrying a knife. Any idea who these people are?
Why is Elijah carrying a knife?
Because he was a prophet and he sacrificed things.
Oh,
That's my guess. He was also kind of dangerous, I think. Any idea who these guys are?
hmm.
Peter, James, and John. They're the three that go up there. Let's see if we can look down here. Can't really tell, but anyway, there's another altar down here. This presumably they built on what they felt was the the actual location. I'm not sure why there's a double altar, but another chapel to Mary. Yes. And this was the best view I could get. I can't tell what that's supposed to be, so I'm sorry to not be very helpful on that. Maybe the resurrection. Looks like the resurrection. That looks like a tomb, and he's coming out of the tomb. Any idea who that is? This is the other chapel. It's Moses, right? Yeah. Is that what the muted people said? Okay. For what it's worth, there's biblical stuff that Moses has horns and that his face glows. So they've managed to get both of those into this art. If you, that's a whole other story for another day, why Moses has horns, but yeah. But they've given him horns of light, which works well enough. All right, this is the view from on top of the mountain. One of these is the Jezreel Valley, and the other I can't remember, but it's way up. There was a cow down there. See the cow? And there I am. Oh, this thing is, I can't remember what this was. I think this was the Melchizedek thing. Anyway. Oh yeah. So this was weird. There's this thing is Mount Hermon is also a traditional place where Melchizedek lived, and this building is built over Melchizedek's cave. It was very hard to find, and I think I'll stop at this point with my photo thing because it doesn't have much to do with the rest of the Transfiguration. Oh, there's a nice view on. So that's what the area looks like. So it's very pretty, and we had a good time up there. So let's jump now into. Can you see that? No, you cannot. It's just paused. Let's jump into any comments about the pictures before we jump into the actual Transfiguration. No, you're muted, so I don't know. Nothing. Okay.
No, it was good to see them again. It was good to see it.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to read the Transfiguration. This is from St. Matthew's Gospel. Of note, the Transfiguration happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is referenced in 2 Peter, the second letter from Peter, and there is an oblique thing that could be referred to as transfiguration, like in St. John's Gospel, when later in the Gospel narrative, there is a voice from heaven that confirms who Jesus is. And so all four Gospels have a voice from heaven speaking to Jesus at some point later in his ministry that people can hear. And in John, it sounds like, excuse me, it sounds like thunder in John, and that might match up with what you get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke with the cloud on the mountain. But the scene in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is spelled out in a way that it's not at all in John. So they're basically all the same. We're going to see a bunch of Old Testament related links as we read through, and I'll try to note them as we go. But Charlotte, you're unmuted. Do you want to read the whole thing?
Oh, wow. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to the top of a very high mountain. He was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, look, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him. Listen to him." Hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anybody about the vision until the human one is raised from the dead." The disciples asked, "Then why do the legal experts say that Elijah must first come?" Jesus responded, "Elijah does come first and will restore things. In fact, I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they didn't know him, but they did to him whatever they wanted. In the same way, the human one is also going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples realized he was telling them about John the Baptist.
Great. Okay. Before I jump in, does anybody have any comments on this or specific questions? All right. So pretty much all of this is really specifically detailed. So 6 days later is 6 days later than what? Do you remember what we were doing? Well, let's go back and see what was going on.
Easter.
We were having a prediction about Jesus's passion. Peter was declaring Jesus was the Messiah. So that's what happens 6 days later. And Jesus has talked about discipleship. You know, anyone who saves their lives will lose it, that sort of thing. So that's where we are leading into this. But the 6 days is probably a reference back to Moses on Mount Sinai. And let's see if I can pull this up. I should have looked at this in advance. It's the 10 Commandments. There's a lot of references to the 10 Commandments in here. And let's see if I can find it. This is going to be messy if I can't find it, so I'm not going to look for too long. Let's try 20. You'll have to take my word for it. The days are, I believe that he makes them wait 6 days and that Moses has to go up on the 7th day. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that's the reference. It's also a possible reference to the Sabbath and resting on the Sabbath and that sort of thing. But Jesus takes with him a select few, Peter, James, and John, and interestingly, not Andrew. Andrew is the other of the first 4, right? The first people that get called are Peter and Andrew, James, and John. And they go to a high mountain. It's never named. I showed you Mount Tabor. If you're in that area, there are other mountains, so it could have been any one of them, but Tabor is the one that is generally remembered. Transformed, this Bible uses transformation. Most of us, I think, know it as transfiguration. And the Greek is basically he's changed. And they used a word that has been translated as transfiguration, mostly because I think trying to get at he's changed in some way that we can't quite figure out. And so to me, I don't like this translation. Sometimes I really like this translation and sometimes I don't like this translation that we're using. But in this passage, there's a lot of stuff I don't like about it. Transformed to me makes it sound like he shapeshifted or something. And that's not really what's going on. What happens here is his face shines like the sun, his clothes become white as light. And so in some way, he becomes what I think would be called angelic or resurrection-like or something like that, right? It's very bright, it's very white, and that obviously is different than what people might expect. Do you remember with Moses and the horns that were on fire and glowing and that sort of thing? There's one of the things that happens with Moses when he comes down from the mountain is his face is glowing and shining so brightly after having been in God's presence that he has to veil it. And in fact, every time he goes into the tabernacle to talk with the pillar of smoke or the pillar of cloud where God is, when he comes back out, his face glows for a certain period of time and he has to veil it. St. Paul writes about that, but this is probably a reference to that, except the difference is that it's not just his face, it's all of him. And in fact, it's also his clothes. So he's more than Moses. Does that make sense? That's probably the reference here. The high mountain is, we're obviously not in the wilderness that we were between Egypt and the promised land. So this doesn't happen at the same place where Moses did that. But so it's a high mountain is probably another Moses reference. However, Elijah also goes to a high mountain, right? He goes to Mount Carmel, and he ends up seeing and encountering God as well up on a high mountain. So Moses and Elijah give us the sort of the background of one place where you can often encounter God, or at least some people seem to have, is on top of a very high mountain. And so that's where that happens. And amazingly, guess who shows up? Moses and Elijah immediately show up. And so if you thought that this was strange, and I think in the context of the gospel, even after the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, the level of miraculous has been going up. I still think this is of a totally different level. Like when you suddenly have Moses and Elijah show up out of the blue, literally, because they're on top of the mountain talking with Jesus, it's gone to a different level. And we've been talking about the law. Right down below, we have the legal experts. Those are people that are experts in the law of Moses. We've been talking about things that Moses did. We've been talking about Elijah and that sort of thing. And now it makes it clear, at least at this point, that Jesus is on equal footing, again, literally, with Elijah, right? And so they're talking with Jesus. And then there's a reaction by Peter, which is interesting. Lord, it's good that we're here. And I don't like this translation. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. The Greek is 3 tents. Mm-hmm. And shrine is a legitimate translation of that because the tabernacle was a tent, right? And so the people of Israel built a tent that they set up. It was a very special tent, but the original temple was in a tent that was movable and was set up in the wilderness and was able to get moved around. But the people of Israel also lived in tents and moved around with them. And there's a Jewish feast called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And in that feast, I believe to this day, people are sort of try in some way to observe living in a tent for, or at least worshiping in a tent for some period of time throughout the feast. And my understanding of this passage is that it could be read that, yes, we're trying to set up a tabernacle shrine for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, which would certainly be a misunderstanding of who gets to go in the tabernacle, because God was the one that was in the tabernacle and Moses went in to visit. But what I really think is going on here is that they've realized that they're in the presence of God in some way, and so they want to set up shop and basically be like the Israelites, living around the presence of God. But it could go either way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. Anything thus far? Questions on anything I said or didn't say? Or
I
got a question.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This what is it? Verse 13, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is telling them about John the Baptist, but before this, he's speaking about Elijah. Is Elijah? I don't understand the connection between Elijah and John the Baptist.
So the question that the disciples ask is, clearly there is some messianic interpretations floating around and expectations floating around at Jesus's time. And we get them in a couple of different ways through the Gospels. We get often some of the questions about who the Messiah will be, right? The Messiah will come. We started the Gospel with that. The Messiah will come from Bethlehem, right? The Messiah will be David's son. So there were some general expectations about the Messiah. And one of them seems to be that Elijah must come first before the Messiah comes, right? That there's going to be a forerunner of the great prophet Elijah who will prepare the way, so to speak, for the Messiah, right? And we don't part of the challenge that we have is we tend not to have what was being said. We have secondary references like these where, oh, this is the understanding, but we don't have like the original source material that says this was the understanding, whether it was word of mouth or whatever. But they had interpreted some of the passages in the Hebrew scriptures, in the prophets, and also there's other literature before the New Testament that comes out, that some of it was very heavily messianically based. And there were expectations about what was going to happen. What's interesting, I think, is that Jesus seems to accept those expectations, right? Often he will say, you are right that the Son of David will do whatever, and that sort of thing. And in this case, he says, yes, you are right. Elijah does come first and will restore all things. But what he does here is he says Elijah came in the form of John the Baptist. And so whatever that expectation was about Elijah, Jesus has said, yes, this is a correct expectation. And everything you were looking for was already in John the Baptist, who is dead. Because we just, read 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, his beheading. And you didn't listen to him back then in the same way. And he draws a link. This is another thing I don't like about this translation, is the human one is the Son of Man, which Jesus has identified himself with from the beginning, basically. But just as John the Baptist was not known and they did whatever they wanted, i.e. they killed him, right? The Son of Man is also going to suffer at their hands. And in that case, it's interesting to note that their hands there, and if you remember Elijah's number one person that he has problems with is it's Jezebel, the queen, and Ahab or Ahaz. I think it's Ahaz. It's the king and the queen, Jezebel and Ahaz. And he has a lot of problems with the royalty and their how they do things. John the Baptist, one of the things we didn't talk about is one of the parallels between John the Baptist and Elijah is that his whole issue, interestingly, is around the reason that he gets killed is around Herod and his wife, right? Herod takes his brother-in-law's wife and they have this big party. And we never talked about it, but there are a number of parallels between John the Baptist and how his story is narrated and Elijah. So what's going on here, I think, is that we're getting a peek into a 2,000-year-old tradition that we don't really remember anymore much of, right? That Elijah was supposed to, that there was some tradition that Elijah was going to come before the Messiah. We don't really know what that was supposed to be like, but what we do know is Jesus seemed to accept it, and Jesus and the early church equated that tradition with John the Baptist coming before Jesus. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah.
JD, did you have a question?
Yeah, mine's kind of off of this a little bit, but you brought it came up. So the whole thing with Moses and the horns and all.
Yes.
Is that where this whole Jews having horns thing comes from?
Yes.
People believe
the horn in I believe that's where it comes from. So
okay.
The horn
Just curious.
The horn is a sign of authority. I don't have it here because I gave it to Jeffrey, but the shofar that I picked up in Israel is a horn. There's you poured oil out of a horn for reasons that off the top of my head I can't remember all of them, but a horn is a sign of authority. And one of the images that pops up, and I know it's in Hebrew but I have a feeling that it predates even that and that it extends into other cultures of the time. I have a vague memory of that from seminary, is that you're talking around the Canaanite times and earlier, there was an image that if you had horns, tough and you had authority. You were the difference between a sheep and a ram, right?
Right.
And so somebody that had horns, and literally had a horn, was somebody that had authority and should be respected. I believe that's where it comes from. And
Okay.
it gets,
And so now it's
strangely-
carried forward into this prejudice thing.
well, yeah, and I
What's-
don't
what?
know where the image of the devil with horns comes from at all. And so it gets turned into this image of the devil with, hoofs and horns and part animal, part, red demon sort of thing. And attached to that, and I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from, is that in art, and I think where you're looking is people looked at, let me see if I can pull that thing up again. It's okay. If people looked at Moses in Christian art having horns and took that in a negative direction because they didn't know what it meant.
Well, I mean, right, because I know there's this whole thing of, some people believe, have this thing, I mean, even still, that like Jews have horns, and it's a
Right.
way to,
Right.
You know.
It came up in the movie Borat, for what that's worth. Like that actually, which
right.
as a joke, but
I mean, I knew somebody who was telling the story when he went to college, and his roommate said, "Can you take your hat off? My grandfather says Jews have horns. I want to see your horns." And like,
right. That
Person-
is a very classic, unfortunate anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish
yeah,
trope. And I believe it has its origin in art, in Christian
Okay.
art,
okay,
which ironically was meant to show that Moses had special authority. And
Okay, cool.
yeah, so in the piece of art that I showed, I'll share it again if I can find it.
So it gets flipped.
Well, it gets flipped from being something good and special. And there's a lot of, that's a whole other conversation that we could have at some point in this class. There's a lot of it's called supersessionism. It's here it is. Here's the screenshot again. Photos.
Where's my camera pointing?
So there's the image of Moses, and what this is supposed to be doing is equating the Moses' face glows with the Moses tradition of Moses, and kind of taking it in a new direction. You could make an argument that perhaps Christian art ought to stop putting Moses with horns at this point because it has turned into something negative. But there's and not just negative, like, the whole business of a lot of the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic stuff is not just, it gets into racism in a very horrendous way, that it's like they're not people, right? It turns into a
Right.
different thing. And but there's a line of sort of modern trying to deal with things called trying to avoid supersessionism, which there's Christians historically have often looked at things in the scriptures and said that, right here, Jesus is doing something and he has made irrelevant the old ancient Jewish festival. The problem with that is that modern Jews do not think their feasts are irrelevant or their services are irrelevant. And so you end up with a Christian viewpoint that basically says Christianity supersedes and eliminates Judaism, which has proven very, very problematic. So more often, at least mainline Christians try to steer clear of that sort of thing and say, no, these are types of, and we have it in the Transfiguration is full of this. You have Jesus is up on the mountain, Moses is there, Elijah is there. And one interpretation that has been laced throughout Christianity is that and we have moved on and Jesus has superseded all of these things. That's generally not a good interpretation, because it has led to anti-Jewish, frankly, violence and anti-Semitic stuff as well. It's kind of unavoidable sometimes, but it's also worth pointing out that, well, not the violence is unavoidable. I mean, the interpretations are sometimes kind of unavoidable, but it's also pointing out that that's not really what we're trying to talk about, is that it's not wiping all this stuff out. It's that in a new way, Jesus is doing something different, but using the images and the people and the feasts and the rituals from his religion, and they're getting reinterpreted. I wasn't intending to talk about supersessionism today, but that's kind of a bigger conversation if we want to go down that. Did anything I say there make sense? Or
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right, back into Transfiguration so we can finish it. Where is it? I will say one other thing on that is one of the things that has continually been brought up in recent years to general convention and the wider church is the Holy Day lectionaries and the Sunday lectionaries, where if you listen carefully, there's a fair amount of readings that could be read, especially if you pair them with other readings. You can pair things up and interpret things in fairly negative ways towards Jews. And the church, at least recently, has tried to avoid doing that by making sure certain readings and interpretations are not paired together, because historically, it's not that difficult to find examples of this. Historically, there has been a fair amount of anti-Semitism coming from pulpits and coming from for what it's worth. It's only, in the Vatican, one of the things that Vatican II cleaned up was that in the prayers of the people on Good Friday, the church used to pray for the conversion of the Jews. I mean, and we don't do that anymore, but it was not all that long ago that the church used to publicly pray for the conversion of the Jews. Now, you could say, don't we pray for the conversion of all people? And to a degree, sure, but you don't necessarily want to single out the Jews on Good Friday, on a day where there is an interpretation throughout the John reading that it's not the Pharisees in John, right? It's the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And you read that, and then you pray for the conversion of the Jews later in the service. It doesn't sit well with people. So there's a lot of cleanup that has been tried to go on over the years. But when anti-Semitism and that sort of thing surfaces in terms of threats on synagogues, there is a reason why the rabbis often are like, can we get a little help, Christian friends? Because you guys have a little bit of background on this that has not helped us. And people have been formed with whoever said, was it JD, with the roommate whose grandfather said, take off your hat, hat or whatever it was. There's still people that have this. So anyway,
it's kind of a sad tradition of the church to use the Bible against people, right? Because people used to say the black people are black because it's the mark of Cain, which means that we're evil. And since we're evil, we're children of the devil, and have tails. I mean,
yeah.
I remember my father telling a story when he went off to Europe for medical school, that somebody asked him, do you still have your tail, or was it cut off? He was like, what? So that comes out of the Bible, people misinterpreting what they're reading.
Well, and they're taking it, sometimes they're taking things out of context, sometimes, and context can cut two ways. The letter to Philemon, is it Philemon? The letter to Philemon from Paul is a one chapter, short letter that talks about, from Paul, who's in prison, that talks about asking if this guy Philemon can free his slave Onesimus, because he's been helpful to Paul, and Paul kind of nudging him and that sort of thing. And that letter is not the only time that Paul, or the letters of Paul, deal with slavery. There's another place where basically Paul says, whatever your lot in life is, accept it, and that's fine. And those things have been used to, Philemon has been used to defend slavery and to say, no, Paul didn't want this, but he didn't act hard enough or this or that. And it's worth remembering the context is really radically different 2,000 years ago. Slaves were a different type of thing. It was not necessarily attached to race in the same way. And there were, if you were a conquered people, you were slaves. But, project that with 500 years of modern, treatment of Black people and slavery, and you can get suddenly a scriptural argument supporting why you ought to, and then it morphs into, well, we're going to defend this not just by pulling it from the Bible, but now we're going to pull some strange interpretations out of other things, and just make sure not only your place in society, but you're actually not human. Similar to the horns, right? And no, it's evil. It's really, really horribly evil. You have to watch out for that, for what it's worth, and point it out when it comes up. That's this is a different issue, but it's sad to say on every time we had the awful thing in Buffalo happened last week, right? Clearly based on all the literature that this guy was writing and this and that, targeting Black people at, which is worse, a school possibly, or a church, or a grocery store. And when that sort of thing happens, that it happens at all is horrific. But, you have to somehow, I think, as a church, try to address it. But it same with when there's a synagogue shooting, it's very frustrating as a Christian when people take things and use what I view as a gospel that's all about love and use them to as weapons, basically. So anyway, all right, on that note, let's finish the Transfiguration, and at least, so I just want to, we got a couple minutes left. A cloud is probably a reference to whenever God shows up on a mountain, there's a cloud, right? The pillar of cloud, that sort of thing. The voice from the cloud is also a reference back to the baptism, right? This is my son, the beloved, whom I dearly love. I'm pleased with him, listen to him. And so the disciples clearly recognize that this is God at this point. And then when they get up, Jesus is alone with them. The do not be afraid thing is interesting. That is something that often is said. Can you think of a couple other times where people have been told not to be afraid?
The angel to Mary.
Which Mary?
The mother of Jesus.
Mother of Jesus. Okay. Yeah. You actually answered two.
Is there another Mary?
The angel to Mary Magdalene. Do not be afraid.
Right.
So, so at the crucifixion, at the resurrection, do not be afraid. Right. And so in the presence of holy angels, this seems to be something that is said, for what it's worth, or at particularly divine moments. Anyway, they come down from the mountain, and Jesus tells them not to tell anybody until the resurrection. And so we get another prediction of the resurrection here. This is not exactly the same and then we get a passion prediction right after it, right? That the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. So it's kind of reverse ordered, that the resurrection happens, and then the Son of Man will suffer, and we get this Elijah thing that we had talked about a little bit before. And there is a running theme. I think we've run in, it comes in St. Mark's gospel more often, but it's usually called the Messianic Secret, which is that Jesus, more often than you think, is telling people not to talk to people about what they've seen and heard, right? When there's something really special that goes on, Jesus says, now don't tell anybody. And sometimes it happens with somebody gets healed, and Jesus will tell that person, don't tell anybody. And almost all the time, people ignore what Jesus has said and start telling people. And the reason seems to be, if there is a reason that anybody can come up with, one of the interpretations for why Jesus does that seems to be that whenever people start telling about what they've seen and heard prior to the resurrection, it gets misunderstood. And people begin to think of Jesus as some sort of Messiah that he's not going to be. The focus here is that he'll suffer and die and rise from the dead, not that he'll be some sort of Messiah that comes with Moses and Elijah and angels on the clouds taking over the world. So that perhaps is why they were told not to say anything. Anything on the Transfiguration? We'll read the rest of the chapter next week, but all right. Interesting conversation today. Yeah. So anything else before we, JD, you were blurred earlier or something. You were.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I put together everything quickly and didn't realize that I had put my iPad upside down.
Ah,
So you were seeing the table.
I like that. I like that. Well, there you go.
And I didn't realize it because you were doing, when I came in, you had taken over the screen. So
Right.
I couldn't see my own picture.
That's funny.
And then when it finally came to me, I went, what the hell is that?
Well, now we're back. So,
So
yeah, I mean, interesting stuff. I mean, the Transfiguration is, and the scriptures are full of this, and it's worth pointing it out. More often than you'd think, there's something that somebody has taken in some verse and taken to some weird, evil place sometimes. And scriptures have this, but like, it's fascinating what gets taken and put into a new unknown context, that, the whole, idea of a word that is triggering or something like that to people. And it's worth knowing why. It's like, well, what's the background of that? The scriptures are much older than a lot of other things. And it is worth, I think, hearing the stories of, like, my grandfather was asked, if he had a tail, or my grandfather was asked if he had horns or whatever. I mean, it's like, that's not that long ago. I mean, that's
right.
We have not progressed all that far. And
Oh yeah, no, that was my father, not my grandfather.
your
My
father. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's
literally not that long ago.
no, not that long ago.
Right.
Not that long ago. And yeah, and as evidenced from last Saturday, it has, that sort of thinking has real world repercussions that that are horrific, and frankly are terrifying. So we're just in a Bible study right now, but it becomes challenging from the pulpit. Like, you could preach on this sort of stuff every single week, and unfortunately what you get is people will start saying, all you ever do is preach about politics. It's like, this is real life. This is not politics. This is, so anyway, we'll see. Let's see where we go. On that note, anything else before we go? Nothing. All right. It's good to see you all. We'll be back next week with chapter 17, part 2 of Matthew. All right.
All right.
Hopefully I lose this
Thank
cold.
you.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.